This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzanotes, and today I'm bringing you a bonus video. When a limited format starts winding down, I like to go back and look at my initial limited review of the format and discuss what cards I ended up being significantly wrong about. My limited reviews are completed before I ever get a chance to play with the format, so of course there's going to be some things that I get wrong. With Crimson Vow preview season getting started in the very near future, it seemed like a good time to take a look back at my Innistrad Midnight Hunt review. If you've been watching my new series, Nizzanotes, a series that comes out every Saturday where I talk about Limited, you've already heard me talk some about overperformers and underperformers, but those videos are from a few weeks ago, and this is where I ultimately ended up on this format, so it is a bit different. Anyway, there are a total of 15 cards that I want to revisit, and I want to discuss why it is that I got these cards wrong. I don't really think there were any white cards I got really wrong, so we're starting with blue. First up, it is Larder Zombie. I gave this card a D+ in my initial review, and I think that is a reasonable grade that this card would get in a lot of limited formats. A 1-mana 1/3, sure it can block, but you don't really play cards that just do that, and I didn't really feel like its ability would be good enough to really be worth playing very often, hence the D+, where, I'm saying you play this if you're desperate. But it turns out there are two decks in the format where it is pretty nice. In particular, blue-black. That's sort of what this card is pushing you towards, is the blue-black zombie deck. That deck wants lots of ways to take advantage of all of these zombie decay tokens. And while Larder Zombie's at the bottom of the barrel in terms of payoffs to do it, it's a pretty real one, and it can help you find your other payoffs since it lets you surveil. It's also good in the blue-green deck, which ended up being a self-mill deck, and this can help you set up your draws, mill things that you want in your graveyard, and so forth. And in the end, it ends up being just a solid playable, certainly in both of those decks, and it's kind of okay in the other blue decks too, though not nearly as good as it is in blue-green or blue-black, and that means it's a solid playable. I give it a C now instead of a D+. Next, I want to talk about Mysterious Tome. This card, the flavor is really cool, and I thought it would be pretty nice. Both sides of this card are pretty good, and if it stayed one of these sides all the time, it would be a pretty good card. The problem you end up encountering with it is that you don't get to choose which side it's on. It goes back and forth, and there are typically situations where you wish you could stay on one side or the other and you just can't. And this ends up being kind of clunky. This format didn't end up being blistering fast, but it's certainly one where you need to be adding to the board in meaningful ways, and playing a Mysterious Tome on turn 3 just isn't it. It's much better in the later part of the game. The draw a card side's nice, the Icy Manipulator-like effect is nice too, and it is a playable card, but I gave it a B-, which would mean that you're first picking it with regularity. It certainly isn't that. It's too slow, too sort of finicky overall to be that good, and in the end, it's just like a C, especially if you're in a more controlling deck. That's where it's going to be at its best, and you end up just not playing it at all in some of the blue decks. Next up, it's Organ Hoarder. This card's gotten a lot of buzz, deservedly so. I gave it a B-, which meant I thought it was a very good common. But what I didn't know is that this was going to turn out to be arguably the best common in the format, and it should have been kind of obvious. I mean, a 4-mana 3/2, those are not great stats, but they're enough for this to be able to trade for stuff, and the fact that it gives you card advantage in addition to that means you get a 2-for-1, which, yes, I said in my set review, but I don't think I weighted it adequately when I gave it a B-. The other stuff it has going on makes it good in all the blue decks too. For one thing, it's a zombie, so the blue-black deck likes that. For another thing, it mills you, and the blue-green deck likes that. And really, any blue deck likes it, but those decks have some extra synergy to do stuff with this card. And Organ Hoarder ended up being, not quite a bomb, certainly. If we ever have a common bomb, we're going to have a problem. But it got pretty close, and it was kind of a problem that a common was this powerful. In the end, I think it's a B+. You take it over almost all the rares, uncommons, and mythic rares in the format. That's just how good it is. Next up, it's Scob Wrangler, and you're sort of seeing a recurring theme here. I underestimated the blue-black deck and the blue-green deck, I think. Those are two decks that, it's hard to know how good each archetype is going to be just by looking at the set before you play, and I knew the two had a decent amount of synergy, but there was way more going on than I expected, and I gave Scob Wrangler a C. I knew the upside here, and I understood when I did my set review, and I talked about it in my archetype guide. You can go back and look. I said the idea here is that you're going to do stuff with your zombie tokens. And I was right about that, I guess, but I underestimated just how great it would be to do that with your zombie tokens. And so this is a lot higher than a C. It very frequently allows you to set up a lethal swing. You tap down 2 or 3 creatures, untap and attack your opponent. And it's good that it's not even just for the zombie deck. I mean, that is where it's at its best because you're going wide with these zombie tokens. But it's actually pretty decent in basically any blue deck since it's a 2-mana 2/1 and you can occasionally use it to tap down a creature or two and really alter combat on the next turn. And in the end, this ended up being a great card. I think it was a B. Not quite as good as Organ Hoarder, but quite good. And a card you should be taking pretty early because, again, it slots into any deck and it's excellent in the blue-black deck where it can just take over games. All right, let's move to black now, where we start with another really good common. This one is Diregraph Horde. So this was an interesting card to review because, specifically when I did the review, I was like, this looks really good because even if we just count each of these zombie tokens, like every 2 zombie tokens you get is worth like 1 normal token. This would be a really good card. And so I gave it a B-, again, which means it's a very good common when you take over some of the rares, mythics, etc. But it was even better than that. First, I underestimated, this on its own gives you 3 bodies, which lets your siege zombies and larder zombies and scob wranglers do their thing. And the additional graveyard hate that the card comes with ends up mattering pretty often too. And so you end up really getting a ton of value out of this card in any black deck. Definitely at its best in blue-black, but it's good anywhere because it's just so efficient. It adds 3 bodies to the board, and it hates on the graveyard. And this isn't quite as good as Organ Hoarder, but it's kind of in the same tier in terms of how good of a common it is. It's also a B+. Next up, we've got Ecstatic Awakener. I gave this a C. I thought it would be a solid playable for black decks, especially zombie decks and the black-white sacrifice deck, because, sacking one of those things that aren't that important and transforming this and drawing a card is a pretty good deal. But it ended up being far better than I expected it to be. I gave it a C. It's more like a C that's a build around B-, which means it's a very high quality common at its best in blue-black, but also good in black-white. It just ended up being a card that can really wreak havoc on your opponent. You can transform it at instant speed. You can attack in situations or hold it back in situations, and just the threat of activation is a problem for your opponent, and you can sort of chip in for 1 damage at a time if you want to, because they just have to take it frequently or they just can't attack you because of the demon. And yeah, you end up getting really good value out of this thing overall. You pay a total of 4 mana, give up a creature that probably doesn't matter much, and you draw a card. And it's not quite as good as that sounds, but it is quite good and was a very good common for both blue-black and black-white. And it's okay in any black deck. You do need a bunch of creatures, though, obviously. So next up, we've got Heirloom Mirror. So far, all the cards we've talked about are cards I underrated. That's typically, if I'm going to miss on a card in a set review, that's typically where I miss. I underestimate cards. I don't overestimate them a lot of the time, but most sets have a few of them, and this is one of them. I looked at this card, and yeah, I understood that it was slow, but I liked the idea that you could, pay 1 and tap it to loot, and then eventually you end up with a pretty imposing creature, a 4/4 flyer that can exile stuff and get bigger. This has kind of the same problem as the Mysterious Tome, though, in that you end up not adding to your board in a meaningful way when you play this. You can't really play it early, and then when you play it late, it's often going to be way too slow to actually save you from whatever's happening to you. And so I gave this a B. I really thought this was going to be good, like a nice win condition for control decks overall, and I thought that it looked like a nice card. But again, it was too slow. It takes several turns to do its thing, and it doesn't add to the board until it finally does its thing. And that was just too slow for this format overall. And I think it was a D. I think you almost never play it. The corner case where you do is, yeah, you end up in the most insane control deck ever. And it is a pretty real win condition in that deck. But that deck doesn't come together all that often. So most of the time, you just end up not playing Heirloom Mirror, which is disappointing because the flavor on this card, I think it's one of the best flavor designs in the whole set. Not one of the best limited designs, though. Next up, we've got Morbid Opportunist. I thought this looked quite good. It's another card I underrated. Gave it a B-, which meant you first pick it sometimes. But it ended up being way better than I expected. The ability triggering once each turn, I waited a little too much when I was looking at this. I was like, man, that's a bummer because you can't, lose a bunch of zombies and draw a bunch of cards. But it turns out Just doing it once a turn is plenty, especially if you're in black and you have removal, and you probably do because there's like 4 really good common removal spells in black for some reason in this format. You turn all of those removal spells into 2-for-1s. You turn any sort of combat thing that happens frequently into 2-for-1s. You can just send a zombie in, even if it's not really a good attacker, just to have it die so you can draw a card. It has all of that stuff going on, and it's probably the best sort of value engine in the entire format. Slots into any black deck and is absolutely excellent in decks like blue-black or black-white, but it's good. It's good in all of them. And it's another, non-rare, non-mythic that's a B+. Gets really high up there in its score and is something you take over a lot of the rares, mythics in this set. And pretty much all of, close to, or if not all of the uncommons and commons. I think it's even better, for example, than Diagraph Horde. I don't actually think I would take it over the Organ Hoarder, though, which tells you something about how good that card is. Anyway, better than I thought. I thought it was good. Turns out it's great. Next up, we've got Siege Zombie. Another one of these cards where you tap 3 things to do a thing. Plus, it's a 2-mana 2/2. I gave it a C. I was like, yeah, this will be a nice little card to have around in your blue-black decks. And I specifically said, laughably, that I don't think this is the payoff you're going to be looking for, though. And you know what? It was. So I ended up being just completely wrong there. This is a key payoff for the deck. The more Siege Zombies you have, the better. You can attack in the early game, get them down to like 12-ish, and then spend the rest of the game bleeding them out until you can swing for an Alpha Strike with all your zombies. And it just works out really well. And plus, its floor is that it's a 2-mana 2/2. And it also, like the Wrangler, slots into any deck as a pretty reasonable card overall. So I do think it's like a C in your typical black deck that's not going wide. But I think it's a build around B-, a card you really should value highly if you're in blue-black. All right, let's move to red. First up, I've got Seize the Storm. I gave this a C. So this one's funny too because I basically said the same thing. I don't think this is the payoff you're looking for in the blue-red deck. And I wasn't completely incorrect because some versions of blue-red are aggressive and they want the 2-mana 1/3 devil guy, and that's like their big payoff. But there was also grindy versions of the blue-red deck that I found to be pretty reasonable when they came together, and Seize the Storm was basically a prerequisite. If you don't get at least one Seize the Storm in those decks, you're going to have a hard time winning long games. But if you have Seize the Storm, it's pretty impressive. I mean, it's a great win condition. Part of why I underrated it is also because I didn't read the card very well. I thought the way this worked was whatever you had in your graveyard when you cast it, that's the size it would stay forever. We saw a similar card in a set recently, a blue-red card that let you bring back an instant or sorcery, and then you made a token with power and toughness equal to your instants and sorceries. But this is not the same card. It's different. It works differently, and the creature grows throughout the game. So making a creature, maybe it's a bummer that it's a 3/3 for 5 mana, but it will grow throughout the game. It's got trample, and importantly, it also has flashback, so you can get it going later in the game and get that second body out of it. And it's just a very real win condition in the deck. That said, blue-red was not one of the best archetypes in the format, and so this card, while it is pretty good, isn't as quite as incredible as some of the blue and black cards we've seen, because those colors are really strong in the format, and you want to be in them, if they're reasonably open. And red, that's less true about. Still, I do think this is such a key card for the blue-black or the red-blue deck that I think you have to sort of look at it as a build-around. It's a C in a lot of decks, maybe even worse. It is worse in a lot of decks. It's probably more accurate to say it's like a D in your typical deck and a B in a blue-red deck. Next up, it's Smoldering Egg. I gave this a B-. Yeah, that was not a good grade. That means I thought it was good, but it turns out it's great. I said in my set review, I realized that you got to remove a counter based on the mana you spend. So I was like, you can flash back 1 or 2 things and this will really get going. And everything I said in my set review was accurate. This will turn into a scary win condition late. It does all kinds of awesome stuff. Most of that stuff's true, but what I didn't account for is that pretty much any red deck can transform this thing. Obviously, blue-red can too, but it fits into pretty much any of the decks. Most decks in this format have a few spells, and you don't need more than a few, especially because of flashback. I do think it falls a little short of being a bomb because of the setup and everything, but once it does transform, it's a really big problem for your opponent, and it's more like a B+. All right, here we got Sunstreak Phoenix. This one's an interesting one. It was a contentious one. I gave it an A+ in my set review. I had it as the #1 bomb in the format, in my top 10 bombs, in Innistrad Midnight Hunt video. That's what I gave, the number one slot to. And I'm here to tell you, everyone who told me I was wrong, you're right. Most of you. Some of you said that this card was just straight bad and trash and etc. and things like that. And it just isn't. I do still think it's a bomb. It's certainly not the best bomb in the format. And I guess I just sort of overestimated how good it would be that this can keep coming back. It's nice that it can, but this format has so many flyers thanks to Disturb and things like that, and other flyers that basically come back, that this isn't quite as impressive as it looks. I do, again, still think it's a bomb, but it probably wouldn't even make my top 10 bomb list now. It's probably like a top 15 bomb. So I think it's more like an A minus. You still take it basically every time you see it, pack one, pick one, because it's highly unlikely there's another A-level card in the pack. But it isn't as good as I thought it was. Having the mana available to bring it back isn't always something you can do. It's not quite as amazing as just this 4-2 that keeps coming back. I sort of envisioned it being like Ebb and Death, but Ebb and Death's a lot better for various reasons. And so in the end, A minus is what the Phoenix gets. It's certainly not trash, that's hyperbole, but it's also not the best bomb in the format. Next up, we've got Tavern Ruffian. This is a big vanilla creature. It's one that I gave a C+ to, purely based on the fact that it was big and, it's a werewolf. That's a useful creature type, right? Yeah, well, unfortunately, the red-green color pair in this format ended up being the weakest one. That's not to say you couldn't draft it. If it was wide open, you certainly could, and you could end up with a decent deck. But on average, it was hard to end up in a good red-green deck in this format that did quite well. And part of the reason is these big vanilla creatures just aren't great in the format. This is a 4-mana 6/5 sometimes, and that's awesome. And that's why I gave it a C+, which means it's a pretty good common. You're going to play it in a lot of your red decks, and I was not correct. Mostly because, the front side is so unimposing that it's not something you're that interested in more aggressive decks. That's part of the problem. The other problem is just being a big vanilla creature that doesn't give you any sort of value at all, or the ability to, get you a 2-for-1 somehow by coming back from the graveyard. There's just so much good removal in this format that cards that are just big creatures that give you no other value went way down. And in the end, a card like this, I'm not saying it's unplayable. You would play it in a lot of your red decks, especially if you end up with werewolf synergies, but it's a C-, not a C+. And that's a pretty significant difference in grade. C- means you cut it more often than you play it. C+ means you always play it, or, the first copy at least always makes it into your deck. So, significant difference there. All right, let's move into green, where I gave Eccentric Farmer a C-. So one thing I missed on in a big way in my set review and in my archetype guide is that the blue-green deck is sort of a general graveyard deck, and self-mill in particular. I knew the deck was about flashback. I figured that part out. That wasn't that hard to figure out, but I kind of didn't pick up on the amount of reasonable self-mill there is in the color pair and how much value you could get out of it. And so a card like Eccentric Farmer goes from being a C-, which just means you'll play this. It's nice that it makes sure you hit your land drop. Maybe you'll load your graveyard with a thing or two you want in there. Just sort of a nice role player, 3-mana, 2/3. You'll play it sometimes. It went from that to being the key common for the blue-green deck in this format, which was all about self-mill. It could enable 3-color decks or you to play like 15 lands if you picked up 3 or 4 Eccentric Farmers. It just made your deck so much better. And effectively, blue and green have so many cards with flashback and disturb in the color pair that frequently when you mill with Eccentric Farmer, you mill 3 cards, you get 1 land back, and you've probably also milled like 1 thing with Disturb or Flashback, which is effectively a card in your hand. And so that's like what the deck ended up being all about in blue-green. And so, I do think this is better in general in this format than I thought, but not substantially so. Like in your typical green deck, it's probably just a C, but it's like a B. It's a high-quality, high-pick common in the blue-green deck. And there are definitely pack one, pick one scenarios where picking one of these up is not a bad plan if the pack, doesn't have anything else with a similar ceiling. So yeah, this ends up being a lot better than I thought. It's a very, very important card in the format, and blue-green ended up being my favorite color pair to play in the format, so I played a lot of Eccentric Farmers. The deck ended up being open a lot after everyone sort of figured out blue-black, so I ended up with lots of multi-Eccentric Farmer decks that were pretty sweet. Next up, there's Turn the Earth. This is similar. I gave this an F. I didn't like the idea that you don't really get a card worth of value back from playing this ever. And that's not incorrect. Casting it and flashing it back, even if you do both of those, you're going to gain a total of 4 life. You're not really getting a full card worth of value in a typical limited format. And this would be an F most of the time. But it ended up being a decent card in that same blue-green deck, mostly because you mill yourself a lot, and mostly that's upside. But if you have some like great win condition, or maybe you have Ominous Roost as your win condition and you mill it, you need to have ways to get things back into your deck or back into your hand. And this was sort of my preferred way to do it because it was so cheap and efficient. And the blue-green deck, it could sort of be a more aggressive deck sometimes, but it was more often than not a more mid-rangey, grindy deck that got value out of the graveyard. And there are multiple times where I had like one of these and the life gain from it actually mattered too, because it suddenly gave me one more turn to win the game that I would have had otherwise. It is still an F in your typical deck in this format. You don't play it in any other green deck, but it's a build around C. It's a card you end up playing one of a decent chunk of the time in the blue-green deck. Certainly not something you should take early because it has an abysmal floor and the ceiling's not that high, but it's a nice card if you're in blue-green. All right, so those are all the cards I wanted to talk about, the cards I was significantly wrong about in this format. Crimson Vow limited review is just around the corner, believe it or not. The preview season should be beginning the same day this video goes up, I believe. And, you know, once the full spoiler drops for Crimson Vow, I'll be jumping on the set review, putting out a video every day like I always do. And, you know, as usual, I'll get a few things wrong, but for the most part, I think my set reviews end up being helpful for getting people used to the format. So if you want to make sure you catch that and things like that, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. And if you want to go the extra mile supporting what I do, you can do that on Patreon. Thanks for watching.